and to think about and to learn from. And tonight we're not going to follow it page by page, so you can just take notes on what I'm teaching tonight and listen, and then you can go back and reference it when you have a chance. You'll also notice that this handout has an appendix to it. It's additional information that I wanted to share with you. There are no assignments in that appendix section, but I thought it was important information for you to know as we go forward. It's not material that I'm going to cover in an intense fashion tonight, but we will get to it in the future, but I just wanted it to be part of your compendium of material. So in week 1, we covered the basics related to nouns and pronouns. And now it's time to learn about verbs and also the introduction to diagramming. So that's the session for tonight. You know, you need a common language as grammarians, since you are now students of words. And each profession has its own style or vocabulary of thought that must be mastered before a person can feel at home in it. So the law certainly does, the legal profession. And so does architecture, as is with engineering and education and accounting and healthcare and computer programming and carpentry, you name it. They all have their own unique vocabulary related to the nature of their profession. And so it stands to reason that English grammar would have its own too, and it does. And so you'll see throughout the next weeks that I throw a lot of terms around, terms that you perhaps have not been that familiar with. So last week you learned a lot about nouns and pronouns and the different types and categories of pronouns. Perhaps you came in and didn't know at the time indefinite pronouns, relative pronouns, demonstrative pronouns. Maybe you didn't know, well, the term antecedents. And this week you'll learn about linking verbs and the future perfect tense and the subjunctive mood. So these are all terms that we use in our vocabulary as not only grammarians, but you hear these terms used also when the pastor and the speakers are talking about the different tenses. In fact, I was sitting back there and I was hearing Pastor Roxer speak about the future perfect tense. So these are terms that we use in our study of the Word of God as well. So we don't get all bent out of shape when we hear these words because we learn its function and its use. And I think in probably 98% of the examples that I give, I will pull from verses for us to study. Now, to begin our grammar study, last week we learned the 8 various parts of speech and the function of the different word groups. And we started with the nouns and pronouns. Now I want to talk for a few minutes about your homework. And you will find your homework within the handout. And for this week, I did not give much homework, simply because this is what I want you to do. I want you to read the handout well, go back and revisit it. Also read the handbook, and I'm referring to the Becca handbook, and I've noted in the handout what sections to read there. And also next week we have the Bible conference. And I know that's going to take our time and attention, so I wanted to devote it to that. Yes, yeah. Because I'll be here too. So and I wanted you to be aware of that I was very mindful of that. And you might choose to revisit the presentation today since there's a lot of information that I'll cover. So again, not a lot of homework, but probably more reading and studying than anything else. Regarding the homework, you'll be submitting it to me tonight. Those of you who are the on-site students, and those who are the off-site students, I request that you send it electronically to Tom Stiegel, and he'll print it and put it in my mailbox, and I'll tell you why. There are a lot of assignments throughout the year, and then when we get to the composition section, there'll be a lot of pages, and my little home printer, would be hard-pressed to be printing all of this material. Certainly, I could correct some of the things electronically, but I really found the purpose in working with your own work and giving it back to you and making notes on it. So that's how we're going to conduct it for this year. So I hope that works for you. Again, you can contact me anytime. Usually every day I'm on my email checking any information that comes from you or questions that you might have. And again, you can phone me or text me if you choose to do that. I thought was very important that we go back, though, and do a review of the material that we learned, because I want to make sure that you have embedded in your thinking the nouns and pronouns, because they play such an important part in our language. So let's see if you're able to answer these questions, and I don't doubt that you can, or you can't. Let's do number 1. If you would define a noun, it would be defined as a what? And anybody on the offsite can come in as well with this if they like. How would you define it? A person, place, thing, or idea is how we defined it. And nouns can be into 2 categories. They could be, what would be considered the word rocks? That would be what type of noun? It's an object, so it would be a concrete noun, right? Concrete noun. Or like courage, that's an idea, that would be considered a what type of noun? Abstract. And what nouns would name specific people, places, or things, such as Mississippi River and Bible? Those are the proper nouns. And they say we're so proper we want to be capitalized. And then you have those nouns that said you don't need to capitalize us, because we name general people, places, or things like girl, river, and bridge, and those are considered common nouns. Well, what stands in for nouns? What term is used there? Pronouns. And pronouns are interesting. I think last time I mentioned there are about 74 of them. And when you think about the fact that there are 550-some thousand nouns in our language, almost 55% of the words we use, and only 76 pronouns, those pronouns have a lot of heavy lifting to do. They have a lot of work to do. And so they're like stuntmen, if you will, if you want to think of them like that. When nouns feel overworked, they call for pronouns. Words like he, she, it, they, them, and so on. The noun to which a pronoun refers is called its antecedent. So for instance, in the example given, Bill was late. He forgot to set an alarm. I have that picture there because when you oversleep and you look at your alarm, don't you see that all of a sudden late? You don't see the time, just, I am late, and I need to get going. But what is the antecedent in this example? Bill. Bill's the antecedent, the noun to which the pronoun refers. Now, pronouns take a humble position, and do you remember how I defined it? Pronouns are substitute, and they're very humble, and they say, I am for the noun. I'm going to help them out. Now, try not using a noun for an hour when you're speaking. Just try that. See if you can. I doubt it. The only way you could do it is if you don't say a word. Because we use nouns frequently, not only in our speaking, but also in our writing. We also learned last week, or last session, that pronouns can be very tricky, and they can get us in a whole lot of trouble because we tend to use them incorrectly sometimes. And they can take many forms. They're highly inflected. And I hope that you didn't suffer from pronoun anxiety this week as you went through and looked at the various pronouns in the verses that we had to review. See if you can recall this. Personal pronouns are categorized into 3 cases. Do you remember the 3 cases of personal pronouns? Nominative or subjective? Did I hear objective? Objective and possessive case. So those are the 3 cases, and we'll look at the verses in just a minute. But subjective case, they will work only when they are in charge. Nominative or subjective, they say, I'm taking the subject position. They initiate action in a sentence. They are the doer of the action or the one who acts. The objective case pronouns will work only when they are lazy. And they're saying, I'm going to receive that ball, so to speak. So if I throw you the ball, the direct object or the objective case would say, well, I'll take it. But I would be doing the work. They are the ones having action taken on them. They're the ones who sit back and let it all happen to him or her. And then we also learned that I is exclusively a subject pronoun, whereas me is exclusively an object pronoun. But on the other hand, you's going to stand for everyone. So in a minute, we're going to look at that. So look at the verse from Hebrews 13:3. I will never leave you nor forsake you. Identify the pronoun I. What case is that in? nominative or subjective case because it's in the subject position in the sentence. Look to me and be saved from Isaiah 41:10. That is in the objective case because it's look to me and it's in a prepositional phrase there, so it's in the objective case. And take no thought for your life. There is an example of a what case? Possessive case, because it's referring to what type of life? Your life. And it's also being very descriptive, so it's really considered like a possessive adjective, isn't it? Because it's describing what type of life. So we see the pronouns, again, function in different capacities and in different forms. But that second person you pronoun. You gets called to the set whether the scene needs a subject or an object. So you email the student. Where's the subject? It is you, and it's taking the action, so it's in the subjective position. The student emailed you. Here, the you is in the object getting emailed. Now, the you can take this position. I could say, you should read the handouts. Or I can make it plural and say, you should read the handouts. You is very tricky because a lot of times students, when they're writing, tend to want to get into that you position rather than the I, and we'll talk about that in a few moments. So that you can be very, it can move around a lot. And it also fills in for one person or many, so it can be singular or plural, as we just noted. So the possessive case shows ownership, like yours, mine, and ours. Some possessive pronouns can stand alone, such as mine, yours, hers, ours, and theirs. And some people call these strong possessive pronouns. So here's an example. This is mine. Or is this yours? But some possessive pronouns need a noun, like my, your, his, her, our, and their. And these are referred to by some grammarians as weak possessive pronouns. And others call them possessive adjectives. So that is her Bible. It's describing whose Bible it is. He went with her to church. There, her is moving in the object position in the objective case. So again, those possessives can float around, and that's why we always have to go back and study how is it used in the sentence. So we look at these very methodically and grammatically when we find out how they're being used and how we can identify them and their function in the sentence. If you look at your chart that I gave you last week, you'll notice that his is on both lists of strong and weak, and it can take those forms as well. So I just wanted you to be aware of that. Point of view. Pronouns have the authority, if you will, to express to the speaker or the writer the point of view of a particular story or piece of writing that is being told. So pronouns can tell the story from the point of view of the person who is talking or writing. What is that referred to? Do you remember from your chart? That's the first person point of view. If the person directs the text to you, the reader, it is in what person or what point of view? It's in the second person point of view, which directs the text to the reader. It's usually used in process analysis writing or giving directions. The first person point of view is usually used in if you're going to be writing your testimony or you're going to be telling a story. Now I'm saying this because when we get into composition and writing, students often make the mistake of going into the second person point of view when they're really telling it from a first person point of view. They're telling it my story. And they move into the second person because in some psychological way, they want to distance themselves from the story. So I go back and I ask the students in my writing, when I'm writing them back, I say, what point of view do you want to tell this in or share this in? Are you going to be in the first person from your perspective? Are you going to be in the second person, you? Or, here's the other choice you have, you can be in the third person, which observes the story from the outside. The writer lets you know what is happening in different people's thoughts and can follow the different characters or present research or ideas from others. Many articles in the Grace Family Journal are in the third person point of view. So if you pick up the latest Grace Journal, you'll notice that I would say at least 60%, maybe more, are in that third person. There are several that move into the first person point of view if they're telling a story or a personal narrative. And then some are very directional, where they're telling you how it is, and they're moving into the second you point of view. So that's the beauty of pronouns, too, is they give you the perspective or the point of view of the speaker or the writer, whichever the case may be. So I hope you're getting to like pronouns. Even though there are not many of them, they play a big role in our speech and our English. All right, let's go on to more pronoun types. What are the pronouns, such as everyone and anybody, that do not relate to a person as clearly as personal pronouns do? What are those referred to as? Indefinite. It says it right in its title, doesn't it? I'm indefinite. Not quite sure. I represent a number of different nouns, and I often sound like a lot of people, but you usually treat me as a singular as far as the number is concerned. So, for instance, from Romans 14:7, for none of us lives to himself, and no man dies to himself. There's an example of an indefinite singular pronoun. And then we have the words this, that, these, those. And these are called what kind of pronouns? When they act like nouns and you can imagine pointing at something. Those called demonstrative. And do you remember what I said about when we use demonstrative pronouns more often than not? Remember my statement on that one? Yes. Yeah, we tend to use demonstratives more when we're speaking than when we're writing because they aren't specific enough quite often. So we tend to use them. And here's, I put an example. So here you have a man who's pointing, and he could be saying, this is God's creation, as he's pointing out there. And he could be saying that to somebody. So you're there and you're participating in what he's pointing to. If indeed he says this, that star shines brightly. Oh, I've now moved to not just a demonstrative pronoun, I have moved into a what? That star shines brightly. I'm describing the star, so now I have a demonstrative adjective for it because I'm describing that star. You see how fluid that is? If you recall, I also mentioned last session, and we'll see this often, the word that is extremely fluid and it moves around in different positions, so we have to watch it carefully. It's used frequently, but we always have to examine how it's being used and what its function is. Okay, well, let's try some more. What about, for instance, myself? It's what's called a what kind of pronoun when the subject is mentioned again in the sentence. Okay, reflexive in this case. Reflexive, and reflex means it comes back. So if you say, for instance, I see myself in the mirror, there you have yourself a reflexive pronoun. So just think about looking in the mirror and seeing your reflection, and that's a good example of a reflexive pronoun. Others are himself, herself, yourself, itself, ourselves, and themselves. I see myself witnessing to my friend. The subject is mentioned again in this sentence. Now, I also warned you last week that a reflexive pronoun can only be used the object of a sentence. It can never be the subject. So you would never say, myself drove to church, would you? Or would you say this, John and myself drove to church? No, you would not say that as well. Because the reflexive pronoun is the right choice when the subject is mentioned again in the sentence, as you see in the example that I noted. I see myself witnessing to my friend. And I say that because you'll hear a lot of people, it's problematic to many people when they're speaking or when they're writing. Now, reflexive pronouns can also be used to add emphasis to a sentence. And then what are these called when its emphasis is given? These are called what kind of pronouns? Intensive. Sometimes say they're reflexive intensive, and some just call them intensive. But they really mean what they say. It's intensive. It's driving home a point. And here's a verse I found this week. I thought this is a wonderful example of it. From Psalm 76:7. You yourself are to be feared. The repetition of the pronoun deepens the sense. Now, the meaning of the verse doesn't change if you take out the word yourself. But wouldn't it have a different feeling? Because it would lack the added emphasis. Do you agree? So sometimes we like to use those intensive pronouns in our writing. And I want you to know when you're reading scripture how often you will find them. Did you note that when you were studying this past 2 weeks? Because they abound in scripture. So I wanted you to be aware of them. All right? We learned a lot at our session, so there's still more review. What pronouns introduce subordinate or dependent clauses? That, which, who, whom, and whose. What are those called? Say that again, please. No? There, it starts with an R. Relative. It does start with an R. Relative pronouns introduce subordinate or dependent clauses. Relative pronouns, a pronoun has an antecedent, which is a previously mentioned noun or pronoun or the equivalent within the same sentence. You will learn that they introduce subordinate clauses, and when I teach complex sentences, we'll work more with these in a couple of weeks. So it introduces an adjective-dependent clause. A dependent clause will have a subject and a verb, but not a complete thought. Just a side note, I don't know if I mentioned this last time. As could be a relative too. So just something for you to know. But he who believes in the Son has everlasting life. John 3:36a. The relative pronoun is who believes in the Son, because there we have a dependent clause and it's introducing it. This will be very important for you to know when we move into our dependent clause section of study. What pronouns introduce questions? What are they called? Very good. Interrogative. They introduce questions. They interrogate, don't they? And we note them, the 5 that are listed here. For who has known the mind of the Lord that he may instruct him? Well, this past week, I saw these verses, and I thought, oh, these are perfect examples of some of the pronouns that we were talking about. And I'm going to see if the students can find them. And so here we'll start with 1 John 5:11. And this is the testimony that God has given us eternal life, and this life is in his Son. This verse is filled with pronouns. Should we start at the beginning and work our way through? So first I'm just going to give you a few seconds just to look at that and mentally note the pronouns and see if you can find them and identify them, and then we'll talk about them. Do you see them in there? Should we start and work our way through the verse? All right. I tend to want to give it away. So let's start from the beginning. Who can find the first pronoun? Very good. This. And what type of pronoun is this? Demonstrative. That's excellent, because it's serving in that subject position, isn't it? And it's pointing. This is the testimony, or this is the record, okay? Next pronoun. Us is one. That. Very good. Because it's introducing a clause, isn't it? So what type of pronoun is that? It is relative. I heard somebody say us, excuse me. And what type of pronoun is us? personal, eternal life, and this life is in his Son. What can you give me there? This, which is a, what type of life is it? This life. Is it describing life? So it's demonstrative adjective, yes. And do I have anything else? His, and that is a, very good. It's a possessive, isn't it? It's a personal pronoun because it tells what type of son, in his Son. Okay, Isaiah 7:14, you did very well with that. Let's see what we can find here. The Lord himself will give you a sign. Himself. And that is a intensive pronoun. And we also have you, which is a personal pronoun. Do you notice again the importance of the intensive pronoun? If you take it out, it reads like this. The Lord will give you a sign. But the intensive, the Lord himself will give you a sign. You see the strength behind that? And that's why we learn these parts of speech, and we learn their importance and relevance, and that you could give a message just on that verse alone by just looking at the different words and the part that they play in that sentence. Who's going to give the sign? The Lord himself. And he'll give what? A sign. To whom?
In the first verse there, when this life is a demonstrative adjective, is it still a pronoun then?
Oh, yes.
Okay.
Functioning as a demonstrative adjective. Well, we say demonstrative adjective is what we really call
So
it.
Is it both
not,
a pronoun and an adjective?
No, I would refer to it as an adjective.
Okay.
Yes. I just put demonstrative in there because some refer to them in that way. But it's not a demonstrative pronoun, it's a demonstrative adjective. All right, there's our review. Now we'll move into the bulk of the message today, which is on the verb. We have our people, our places, and our things, which are nouns, established, but they're not doing anything. Enter the verb. The verb is the business end of the sentence. It is the most important word in your sentence. And without a verb, even if it's only suggested, there's nothing going on. Just a lot of nouns standing around with their hands in their pockets because they don't know what to do. So we have to get these ideas, these people, moving. So verbs add movement. Now, verb is easy to spot. So you just look for the moving target, the center of activity, the part that tells you what's going on, and no wonder the verb is such an exciting, most interesting word in your sentence. When you write, I'm going to ask you to learn to choose your verbs carefully. Now, like nouns, verbs come in various categories. The verb's function within a particular sentence determines its classification. So we can sort verbs into action, or linking verbs, or helping verbs. Action verbs are exactly what they sound like. They show action. And that might be physical action, or it might be mental action. Like run, jump, swim, think, decide. So we refer to this as having the active voice. Or they can be linking. Or we could refer to this as a state of being verbs. And there are at least 60 linking verbs in the English language. And I wrote some down here for you, and you'll have some also in your handout. Is, are, was, were, be, being, been, am. Sometimes other words can serve as either linking or action verbs depending upon their use in the sentence. Taste, feel, smell, sound, look, appear, become, seem, grow, remain, stay. So with linking verbs, the action isn't as rugged as it is with linking verbs. But there's more thoughtfulness to them. There's more connectivity with linking verbs because that's just what they're referred to, linking. And also, I have to say, they can be more complicated than the action verbs. Linking verbs aren't about actions as much as they are about connecting other words together. This is so important for you to note. And for the most part, they act like an equal sign in the sentence. In a few minutes, you're going to hear me say that when you're studying grammar, it's a little bit like art and it's a little bit like math. And when we're talking about linking verbs, we're moving more into the mathematical side when we're talking about their function in the sentence. The verb be is the basic, most commonly used linking verb. I'm going to say that again. The verb be is the most commonly used basic linking verb, and the word is a form of the verb to be. So when I talk about, and you hear it said, the passive voice of a verb, it's formed by using the verb be and the past participle of the verb, like have been, has been, had been. All of this will become clear as we work through them tonight and also in the future. We should be using active verbs in about 80% of what we write. And if I would go in and look at text from someone who has written, let's say, an essay the first time through, I would say that would have been switched, that I would find more of the passive linking verbs in the writing rather than the active. And we'll talk about that later, of why is that so. I have my thoughts on it. So if you look at the example, I am Paul, a servant of Jesus Christ, the am there is serving as a linking verb, linking I and Paul together. Well, we have our action verbs, we have our linking verbs, and we also have this category. We have our auxiliary or helping verbs. Sometimes the verbs consist of two or more words, and it's called a verb phrase. And not all verbs are main verbs, so they need help. So the verb phrase will consist of its helper or helpers and its main verb. Now, what do helping verbs do? What do they help with, might be the question. They help to show tense, they help to show voice, and they help to show mood. And we'll look at that in just a little bit. So it's the main verb contains the central meaning of a verb phrase that we're going to see, and is always the last word in the phrase. Now, it's important for us to learn our helping verbs because you're going to see that they help us indicate the mood that the verb is in. So auxiliary verbs have families, and I've included this already in your appendix. But here's your families of helping verbs. The be family. Is, are, was, were, be, being, been, am. You have the have family. Have, has, had. You have the do family. Do, does, did. And then you have the modal, as they refer to verbs, which express the mood of the speaker or the writer. And they talk about the necessity, the possibility, the intention of the action being expressed in the main verb. Here are the 7 main modal verbs, and you have this in your handout in the appendix: should, would, may, might, must, can, could. When you're studying them on your own in the next 2 weeks, please note that the modal verbs indicate the indicative and subjunctive moods. They cannot be used in the imperative mood. And this might sound foreign to you now, but I think that by the time we're done here tonight, this will make sense to you. So again, we have those 3 verb types: action, linking, and helping. And by the end of the semester, when we're talking about linking verbs, I think you're going to be able to rattle them off to me and say, I identify them. Is, are, was, were, be, being, been, am. You'll be able to rattle off to me the helping verbs because we'll use them so much in our lessons and in our homework. and we'll also note it in the verses. You've had first week now in this class, and you had a chance to look at nouns and pronouns. Did that allow you to gain a greater appreciation for the verses that you were studying? It allowed you to dig deeper and see what was going on there? That's what one of the reasons this course is designed to do. And another thing is for us to examine the verbs that are being used in our text. So let's go back and review what I just presented. We have our action verbs, which can express physical or mental action, and they are exactly what they sound like. They take the active voice. As in this sentence, God created all things. Created there is the active voice. It tells you specifically what occurred. Then we have our linking verb category, which describes a state or being. It's not as rugged. It's more thoughtful. It's more connective. It's more complicated than the other verbs. And it takes the passive voice, and it links a word to the subject, and it serves as an equal sign in the equation, so to speak. So if we have this verse, the word was God, we could say the word equals God. That's how powerful that linking verb is in your sentence, how it links it together. And then we have our helping verbs, helping the main verb to make a statement. So the example, only Christ can give you peace. Our verb phrase is can give. You have your main verb give, and you have your helper can. No man can serve two masters. You have your verb phrase, can serve. Serve is your main verb, and can is the helper. And then the hope of the righteous shall be gladness. The verb phrase is shall be, and be is the main, and shall is its helper. So again, we noted the difference in verb voice. Here's the active voice. It sounds more forceful. Jesus healed the woman. Healed is the active voice. The passive voice is the woman was healed by Jesus. Do you see what the passive voice did there? It took the main actor, so to speak, Jesus, and it put him in the back of the sentence, hit him in a prepositional phrase, because the subject can never be found there, put the woman in the front, and it also created a longer sentence. It added more words or verbiage to your sentence. That's what passive voice tends to do. So when you see the passive voice was healed, it's taking that position. Now, we have what are referred to as transitive and intransitive verbs. And transitive verbs take their action on something, which is referred to as the object. And it transfers its actions to the object. So if you remove the object from the sentence, they don't make sense. So he leads me beside the still waters. The verb is leads. Who does he lead? Me. So me is receiving the action, if you will, of the lead. It's considered transitive in nature. An intransitive verb doesn't need an object. Like the simple verse, Jesus wept. It says it all in two simple words, and that's all that needs to be stated. Now, transitive verbs, remember, need an object. So if I would say this, she will lay on the podium. That sounds silly, doesn't it? But if I take an object, she will lay her Bible on the podium. Now I have the object of the verb lay. And that's what transitive verbs do. They take an object and they move on it. They respond to it. They transfer over, if you will. An intransitive does not have the object. So let's see if we can find some from this portion on Genesis 1:1 through 5. I pulled some verses out from this portion just to see if we can find them. So let's locate whether the verb is transitive or intransitive. So darkness was upon the face of the deep. When we're looking for parts of speech in a sentence, we always look for the verb first. So what is the verb? Was. What was? darkness was. Is this transitive or intransitive in nature? Is there an object in that sentence? Darkness was. Was there an object there? No. I think I heard you say yes. Because upon the face and of the deep are two prepositional phrases. There's no object coming out of the linking verb was. Now, some grammarians say that linking verbs are always intransitive. There's some grammarians who say, "'Tain't necessarily so," but I think I would take that first position. The Spirit of God moved upon the face of the waters. Where's the verb in the sentence? Moved. Transitive or intransitive? Intransitive, because there's no object there, is there? Because upon the face and of the waters are two prepositional phrases. So there's no receiver, if you will, of moved. God divided the light from the darkness. The verb is what? Divided. The receiver of that action? Light. So there we have a transitive verb. God called the light day. What is the verb? Called. Is the receiver of that action? Light. So that's transitive. The evening and the morning were the first day. Remember what I was talking to you about regarding linking verbs. Okay, what is the verb in this sentence? Were. So is this a transitive or an intransitive verb, considering the nature of the type of verb it is? Intransitive. Very good. Okay, now this is what I'd like you to do if you have chance the next 2 weeks, because I went in to 1st and 2nd Timothy, and I noticed how many transitive verbs are in the active voice in those two books. Words like charge, commit, exhort, and give. In fact, I think we have time. Take your Bibles and let's look at 1 Timothy 6:11. Okay, are you ready? It reads like this: "But you, O man of God, flee these things and pursue righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, gentleness." What are the two verbs in that particular verse? Flee and pursue. Okay. What are we to flee? What he writes here to Timothy. Things, yep. And what are we to pursue? Wow. Righteousness, godliness, faith, love, patience, and gentleness. 2 Timothy 2:22 I wrote down too. Here's almost a parallel portion that I found. And what does it say in 22? Flee also youthful lusts, but pursue, what again? Righteousness, faith, love, peace. Wow. 2 Timothy 4:5 I wrote down. But you be watchful in all things. Endure. There's your verb. Endure what? Afflictions. Do what? Work of an evangelist. Fulfill. There's your verb. Fulfill what? Ministry. So why do you think that in 1st and 2nd Timothy you see so many verbs in the active voice? I'm just trying to draw a conclusion from this. Let's think about You said that very well, Gus, and I hope that they were able to pick that up. But Gus said the reason why is that he was writing to his son in the faith, as he referred to Timothy. Paul's time was short, knew that his departure was at hand, and he had much to say. And so his message was urgent. And so you see just a lot of active voice in these two particular books. So it's interesting for you to note when you go in and read those books. Now, I have to warn you, and this is part of what the appendix is all about in your handout. Verbs are complicated. And because a verb expresses action, it has a dimension that other words lack. Verbs express time. Verbs reflect time, which is why we need tenses, which makes us tense sometimes when we're trying to figure out exactly what tense the verb is in. Because verbs are highly inflected. We also said that about pronouns too, didn't we? Because they can change and they can have more than one form. So basically, verbs have three varieties. They can have present, past, and future tense. But then each verb can be split into categories: present perfect, past perfect, future perfect tense. And that is for you to review and study this the next 2 weeks, because we'll get to this later on in our studies, but I wanted you to be aware of it. Now, as you're studying these categories, I don't want you to get confused, because verbs tell you what time zone you are in regarding what you're reading or what you're writing. But most people don't realize this, that verbs can be moody too, meaning they can have moods to them, or modes, as we refer to them. And mood describes what kind of action is going on. So there's the imperative mood, there's the indicative mood, and there's a subjunctive mood. Imperative mood. Verbs can be very commanding. Study to show yourself approved unto God. There's an example of an imperative mood. Grieve not the Holy Spirit of God. There's an example of a verse in the imperative mood with the understood you. There can be indicative moods. Most verb forms we use every day are in the indicative mood, which means it makes a statement or it asks a factual question. I want to learn English grammar, for instance. Or, why was English grammar so hard? And then there can be the subjunctive mood, which is the may or might be mood. And it can be the most confusing of those three, because it's used when a verb expresses possibility, probability, or exhortation. And what a difference a little word if can make in the subjunctive mood. Here's an example. If I were taller, I could see over the pulpit. Well, I'm not taller. So there's an example of an unreal wish, if and it is not so. But if and it is so is an example from Romans 6:8. If we died with Christ, we believe that we also shall live with him. So as we move through and we study different moods, we're going to be working with this. So not this week, but it's to come. But I wanted you to be aware of it. The subjunctive mood also has a wider variety and use in the Greek than it does in the English. And when you get to your Greek studies with Tom Stiegel, he's going to teach you that. All right. So we have different flavors of sentences in our English language. We have declarative sentences, we have imperative sentences, we have interrogative sentences, and we have exclamatory sentences. Most of the sentences we write or we read are declarative in nature. They do just what they say. They declare a statement. And they usually have a very predictable order: subject, verb, object, complements, modifiers. But we don't want all of our sentences to be declarative. Our reading and our writing would be too boring. So we like variety in what we read and in what we write. So then we have what we call imperative sentences, which make commands or give a request. Let not your heart envy sinners. It starts right away with a verb, and it has what is called the understood you. Just left it out, but it means it. Or we have interrogative sentences which ask a question. Oh, death, Where is your sting? And then we have exclamatory sentences which show sudden or strong feeling. How excellent is your loving kindness, O God! Exclamation mark. Now, as writers, we're going to find out, we can overdo any one of these sentences. And quite often, novice writers put too many exclamatory sentences into their writing. And you'll find exclamation marks all over the place. So we want to save those for the perfect time and the perfect opportunity. And when you go through the book of Psalms in particular, you'll notice the exclamatory sentences in that book. And it's just showing that strong or sudden feeling. So again, in our English language, we like to have a variety of sentences in what we read and in what we write. So those are the types of sentences. And then we have the elements of a grammatical sentence. We have our subjects, we have our verbs, we have our complements, we have our modifiers, and we have our miscellaneous elements, which you'll notice as we start diagramming. Our sentences always have a subject and a predicate or verb. The subject is that part about which something is said, and the predicate says something about the subject. Now, I'll be honest with you. Subjects are difficult to define, simply. You think that they would be, but they're not. They can be a noun, they can be a pronoun, they can be a phrase, they can even be a clause about which the sentence says or asks something. But I can tell you this, that the subject is the word with which the verb agrees. So we call that subject-verb agreement. And in standard prose, the subject usually comes before the verb in standard prose. So the subject is the one taking the action, and the predicate says something about it. So we have the simple subject is the subject without any modifiers. That's what we refer to as the simple subject. We're going to talk about the complete subject a little bit, which includes its modifiers. But let's just start with the simple, and we'll move to the more complicated. When we're looking for our subject, truly, the thing we should look for first is the verb, and then we're going to find it. It won't lead us astray if we look for the verb first. So the actions of men are the best interpreters of their thoughts. So what is the verb in the sentence? Are. Then you ask the question, who are? Or what are? And the answer to that question leads you to actions, doesn't it? It answers that question, and there you found your subject. And it's important to follow this process because you can get messed up along the way and think you found your subject, and lo and behold, it's in a prepositional phrase. But that's how you find it, and that's called a simple subject. A man of knowledge increases strength. What's the verb in that sentence? Increases. It's action, isn't it? Well, who or what increases? Man, doesn't it? So man, I found my subject. I found my simple subject. Paul and Silas went to Berea by night. What's my verb? Went. Who went? Paul, Silas, and there I found my subject. This time, though, I have a compound subject, which means I have more than one. I have two subjects in that particular sentence. And then we have the predicate, or the verb, and the predicate, remember, is that part of the sentence that isn't the subject. A sentence must have a verb, and in a very simple sentence, the predicate is the verb. And we're going to find the simple predicate here. So in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. We're finding the verb first, and the verb is created, and it's action in nature, and then we go and we want to find our subject, and we ask, who created? God. And there we found our simple subject, and we have our simple predicate. God our Father gives grace and peace. Our verb is gives. Who gives? God. Our Father could be renaming it as in a positive, we could say. But God gives, doesn't he? And there we found our simple predicate and our simple subject. So it's that simple. Are you with me? Now we also can say, well, we have a complete subject and its modifiers, so we don't want to, forget about that. So a complete subject is its subject plus all the modifiers within it that's leading us up to the verb. So a man of knowledge increases strength. Our verb is what? Increases. Who increases? Man. Yeah, there's our subject. And then we have additional words in that phrase, don't we? A is the indefinite article. Will be functioning as an adjective. We'll see that in the future. And of knowledge is a prepositional phrase. And there we see a man of knowledge increases strength. When we look at a complete predicate, increases is the verb, and it tells us what increases strength. Now, we want to make sure that we overcome any problems with sentences that aren't declarative and so easy to find in nature, and some of these are listed here. Interrogative sentences, sentences that begin with there or here, or imperative sentences can trip us up if we don't follow our process and procedure. Should I show you how it works? An interrogative sentence quite often has the subject but its way in the middle of a verb phrase. But we're going to follow our process and procedure, and we won't get it incorrect. So let's look at this one. Can God furnish a table in the wilderness? What is the verb? Okay, what is the verb? We got it now, don't we? It's a verb phrase, isn't it? Can furnish. And there's an example. Who can furnish? God. There's an example of your subject kind of butting its way in between the verb phrase. Interrogative sentences are known for that. Sentences that begin with there or here. I mentioned to my writers that I do not want you to begin your sentence with there and here very often, because there and here kind of mess up your word order, and there and here act this way. Here quite often is an adverb, but it puts itself in the subject position, and there, T-H-E-R-E, can function as an adverb, but it also can function as expletive, which means it's not a grammatical part of the sentence, and the word its can do the same thing. But in this particular sentence, we're going to figure out exactly what our subject is. There was given me a reed like unto a rod. Okay? So what is the verb in this sentence? Very good. Was given. What was given? Reed. There you have it. There it answers a question. There you can find your subject. Because the tendency would be, oh, well, the subject would be coming first, like there. Yes, Gus?
Why would you say, why would the first question you ask be what was given instead of who was given?
You could ask who or what. Either question you could ask.
Who was given, me as the object. If you ask what was given, then it's me.
Okay. Was given is actually the object, if you will, of the verb phrase. So if I could word it this way for you, there was given me a reed like unto a rod. There was given, what? Reed, to whom was it given? Me. Does that make sense? Imperative sentence, go not in the way of evil men. Go. What is the subject of go? You. It's called the understood you, meaning it's there, it's just not stated. So that's what happens quite often in imperative sentences. Now, here's another thing for you to note. Not is not a verb. Not is an adverb. And other words like adverbs can get in the way and get you tripped up, and we'll talk about that in the future, but not is not a verb, so we don't want to underline that as one. I think we're ready to do some diagramming, which will make this probably make more sense once we start diagramming. I had this question. How many of you have experience from elementary, junior high, or high school in diagramming sentences? Not a lot? I don't know what our off-site students would say to that. Diagramming has lost much of its prominence over the past years. Somewhere in the 60s or the 70s, it seemed to come to a dead stop. I think as educators moved in the direction of free expression and away from basic mechanics of writing. And the diagramming system developed by Reed and Kellogg fell out of fashion. And it was in 1877, Reed and Kellogg, grammarians, Englishmen, started the diagramming craze with a text they called Higher Lessons in English. Don't you love that title? Higher Lessons in English. And their quote is this: it teaches the pupil, to look through the literary order and discover the logical order forcing a more searching examination of the sentence. It helps students to become more cognizant of the language. So as a result, they came up with a system. And it's like this. A straight horizontal line, the place where the sentence's most important elements are found. A short vertical slash, bisecting the line. The use of dotted lines as connectors. And its mystical side, the representation of something that isn't there with an X as an all-purpose stand-in. So diagramming is a bit like art because it allows you to have a picture, if you will, of your sentence. And it's a bit like architecture because you're building a foundation. And it's a bit like mathematics because you will see that there's almost geometric shapes that are formed as a result of the diagramming. You will make order and sense out of what we use all the time and we take for granted once you start diagramming. And sentences and all their secrets will be exposed, and now sentences can actually be comprehended and the parts being able to work together. So just like making bread from scratch, sometimes sticking to the basics is the best way to go. And diagramming a sentence will create a clear visual that helps you to analyze what you're writing. So let's do some work with this. Every sentence can be drawn into a picture, which we call a diagram, and it can have a subject-verb pattern. So every diagram has at least two lines. The horizontal line, which we call the baseline, and on this baseline we're going to find the subjects, the main verbs, the direct objects, the predicate nominatives, the objective complements, and we'll learn more about those later. And then you'll see a vertical line that passes through the baseline and divides the subject from the predicate. So in diagramming, the subject goes and is always placed on the far left side of the horizontal line, and that horizontal line is called the baseline, and a vertical line passes through the baseline, separates the subject from the verb. So let's try this. All right. The first thing what we do when we're diagramming is we're going to look for the verb first. So John the Baptist preached in the wilderness of Judea. What is the verb? Preached. And this is a way that I like to do it. I always like to underline my verb twice. Then I say, who preached? John the Baptist. So there I have my subject, and I like to put one line under my subject. And now I'm ready to diagram. And for me, I always like to go in the order that I find my parts of speech. So I write on my line, preached. And I write on my subject line, and I retain the capitalization, John the Baptist. Now when you're submitting your diagramming to me, you have a couple options. You can use an electronic system, which I think is neater. It's available to you. Or you can do it the old-fashioned way. If you want to get out a ruler, make your lines, you can do that too. So whatever works best for you. But here we have it clear. John the Baptist preached. So we are designating the difference between the subject and the verb. John prepared the way for the Lord. Let's find the verb first, please. Prepared. Who prepared? John. So now I'm ready to diagram. I'm going to put my verb in first. And I'm going to put my subject. And now I have them differentiated between the subject and the verb. What if I have linking verbs? These were two action verbs. What do I do there? Same process. Find the linking verb. Ask who or what before the linking verb, just as you did with action verbs. So let's try this from Hebrews 11:9. Abraham was a sojourner in the land of promise. The verb is was. What type of verb is that? Linking verb, thank you. Who was? Abraham, there's my subject. interesting. Abraham equals sojourner here in this sentence, doesn't it? So here I'm ready to diagram. Was, and I retain my capitalization. And if Abraham was. What if I have a verse that has the understood you? How do I diagram that? Well, you find your action word, the verb. You ask who or what before the verb, and the answer is the understood you. So here we have the verse from John 15:4a. Abide in me. What's the verb? Abide. What is the subject? You. It's called the understood you. I mean, it's understood it's there, though it's not there. And we just write it in like that. You abide in me. Now we're ready to diagram it. So we noted this was our verb. We noted we had an understood you. So I'm going to put my verb first, and I retain the capitalization. And then X marks the spot for the understood you. Cast your burden upon the Lord from Psalm 55:22a. What's your verb? Cast. Who should cast? Yeah. Starts with a verb. It's in an imperative sentence. So it makes a command, doesn't it? Here's my verb, retaining the capitalization, and it's the understood you. So X marks the spot. Are you having fun yet? What if we have compound subjects and verbs? How are we going to diagram those? We're going to go through the same procedure before we start in our diagramming. We're going to follow a process. Following process is extremely important in mathematics, and following process is extremely important in grammatical study, especially when you're diagramming and finding the different parts of speech. So, hell and destruction are before the Lord. What is the verb? What are? Hell, destruction. And notice I have a connector here, don't I? And, connecting the two subjects together. I can have compound verbs as well. And I can have compound subjects and verbs in a sentence. So the sentence, Paul and Barnabas went to the people and preached Christ crucified. I'm finding my verbs first. Went, preached. Who went? Who preached? Paul and Barnabas. They're my subjects. And I have two connectors in there, connecting the subjects Paul and Barnabas and connecting the verbs went to the people and preached Christ crucified. Now let's see how we're going to diagram these with compound subjects and verbs. I did not put my verse on here, which I should have done that. So you're going to have to help me with this one, or I have to go back. So Paul and Barnabas went and preached, right? Was it the verbs went? Okay. Preach, correct? Now I have a connector, and on those dotted lines, I'm going to put the connector and right here. My subjects, please, Paul, Barnabas, and they are joined together by and. There. That's how I diagram compound subjects and verbs. Here's another one. This one I did put on my slide, so that's good. The verb we said is are. We said we have a compound subject. We have a connector. So I like to put my verb in first. I don't know what's happening there. And there I've diagrammed a compound subject. Oh, sorry, there it was. I missed it. Guess I was smarter than I thought. And this is from your handout. I put it down. It's on page 15. I don't know if you want to go in there and check that out. But a wise man fears and departs from evil. So I'm going to go through the process, and I'm going to find my verb first. And what do I find? What's my verb in this? Thank you. I have compound. I have a connector. Who fears departs? Man, yep. There's my subject. So, and here I put my connector here. And then I put my subject here. Now, as we move along with diagramming, we're going to be able to identify every single word in our verse or sentences and find a place for them. But right now, we're starting simply with the subject and the verb, and we're going to build our diagrams as we go throughout the semester. A wise man will hear and will increase understanding. Find your verb, please. Oh, we have verb phrase, don't we? And what's the other one? Will increase, another verb phrase. Who will hear and who will increase? Man, that's my subject. So I have will hear, I will increase, and I have man. Whoops, I have to put my connector in here, don't I? There. So it's that simple and that much fun when we're finding our various parts of speech. So when we can identify our verb and identify our subject, we're on a good path. So in summary, in tonight's lesson, we differentiated between nouns and verbs, we recognized verb phrases, and we introduced a grammatical sentence and diagramming. And at our next session, we will see that a subject and a verb are not sufficient to express a complete thought at times. So a third part is needed, which is an object or a complement. And that's what we're going to be studying at our next session. So for the next 2 weeks, again, your actual homework itself is minimal. It's simply going in, finding subjects and verbs, and diagramming them for me, but then reading your handout, reading your handbook, and reviewing any other thing that you need to review so that you get a solid foundation you're thinking about verbs and its various categories, because they can be, as we learned, very complicated. So I am over with my time, so that's it for tonight.